Marvel's Spider-Man from 2018 is without a doubt the greatest video game ever released based off the wall crawler, at least as of right now. It accomplished what no other Spider-Man games before it really could. It told a story that didn't rely too heavily on the comic books, one that wasn't shackled down by a feature film release. It had the freedom to tell an original tale, go in its own direction, and incorporate as many big main event level villains as it wanted to within its impressive narrative. Marvel's Spider-Man, developed by Insomniac, is one of my all-time favorite superhero games. Its gameplay is polished and satisfying, its story is engaging and emotional, and its huge cast of iconic characters with original backstories and designs, that was something I had been dying to see in a Spider-Man game for so long, it's not even funny.
We're all safer now than we have ever been.
Liar!
Before I go on any further though and review the topic of today's video, I should clarify my previous statement. Marvel's Spider-Man is the best Spider-Man game ever made. That is when talking about the Peter Parker Spider-Man, because of course there is more than one now. Miles Morales never ceases to amaze me as a character. He's only becoming more and more compelling as the years go on, as he branches out into other forms of media, and his mainstream appeal and presence grows stronger and stronger. His storylines have implemented a few ideas already found within those featuring Peter Parker, but that's only to emphasize the fact that his story is paying respect to the original character, acting as an homage, while at the same time doing its own thing. Miles has become a role model, a heroic symbol for an entirely new generation of Marvel fans, and it's awesome. His future is very bright, full of endless possibilities. Miles Morales had appeared as a side character in Insomniac's Spider-Man game from 2018, idolizing Spider-Man for all of his amazing abilities and everything he has done for the city of New York. When Miles' father, police officer Jefferson Davis, is killed at an award ceremony held in his honor, Miles would find a friend in Peter Parker, who arranges for Miles to become a volunteer at the local non-profit shelter Feast. Though he is unaware that his friend is Spider-Man at first, that fact becomes clear when Miles himself is bitten by a genetically enhanced spider that had escaped a secret lab at Oscorp, giving him similar spider-like abilities to Peter. Insomniac would make a standalone sequel to their first Spider-Man game, with Spider-Man Miles Morales in late 2020, which of course continued the narrative surrounding Miles and would focus on him mastering his powers and becoming the next superhero in New York, under the tutelage of the original Spider-Man, Peter Parker. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a game I have been wanting to discuss ever since its release. There is quite a lot I want to unpack with it, so let's not waste any more time getting to my review. I do want to quickly thank all of my patrons for voting for this topic over on patreon.com though. This video wouldn't be happening without your support. When Spider-Man Miles Morales was first announced, I assumed it was going to just be a short and somewhat unimpressive standalone expansion, not really adding much to the original game, but it actually did have a lot more meat on its bones than I was expecting, and it feels more like a sequel game than it does a simple expansion, not only in terms of its narrative, but also the changes it makes to its gameplay as a whole. I even found its runtime to be a bit of a surprise. I mean, it's not 20 hours or anything. This is definitely a smaller game in terms of scale compared to its predecessor from 2018, let's not kid ourselves, but I was still amazed it managed to offer as much content and features as it did regardless. The core gameplay of Spider-Man Miles Morales is pretty much the same as its predecessor, with a few extra tweaks here and there. Miles' web swinging feels a bit lighter, quicker, floatier, with his limbs flailing around when he's high up in the air, like his body isn't as used to the momentum yet, and is trying to compensate for the amount of power he's using. It's kind of funny. Some of the animations are really cool, and I think I enjoyed a lot of them more than I did Peter's in the first game. You can also tell the developers were heavily inspired by Into the Spider-Verse, because many of these animations look very similar to the ones used in the film. The combat system has been altered as well to account for Miles' new Venom abilities, the bioelectrical energy his body can produce, that essentially acts as a defense mechanism. The focus meter from the first game has been replaced with a Venom meter, which can not only heal you with the touch of a button, but allows you to activate several Venom attacks. At first, they're a bit awkward to use, but once you get the hang of them, you'll find yourself using them a lot, even more so than the takedowns that are still present from the first game. The Venom attacks are really powerful and really satisfying to pull off, especially when using them against some of the trickier enemy types that gave you some issues in the first game. Here you can just plow through them with ease, and once you acquire all of the upgrades for your Venom and can earn it a lot faster, Miles becomes pretty OP. You can start spamming these attacks essentially. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of Batman Arkham Origins with the shock gloves, because Miles' Venom can go through enemy shields and weapons. It doesn't really matter what enemy type they all fall victim to these attacks in the same way, so there isn't a whole lot of strategy when using them, which is unfortunate. However, I wouldn't consider it to be as broken as the shock gloves were in Arkham Origins. I think the enemy AI is a lot stronger here. There are usually a lot more enemies thrown at you during combat, and of course, the verticality plays a factor as well. Enemies can flank you much easier. Near the end of the game, with it being set at Christmas time and all, during the winter, there is also a sequence where you have near whiteout conditions affecting your visibility. This is something the Arkham Origins developers wanted to include, but couldn't, due to the hardware limitations at the time, and I mentioned in my review of that game how vital that would have been to help balance the combat system a little more. While it sucks we never got this kind of thing in Arkham Origins, I am glad it made its way into Spider-Man Miles Morales. Not only does Miles possess Venom abilities, but he also has another power the original Spider-Man doesn't have, invisibility. Being able to go invisible during the stealth sections of this game, even combat encounters, added a whole other layer to them, which was really fun. Okay, so one thing about this game I did want to quickly address that a lot of people were talking about when this game came out is the redesign Insomniac gave to Peter Parker. Some fans were upset with this decision. When he first appears on screen, it's a bit jarring and hard to take in. Now I know a lot of reviewers online have felt that these negative reactions towards this change were unwarranted, a bit exaggerated, but I couldn't disagree more. I can see why Insomniac may have felt the need to redesign his face, to make Peter look younger, closer to Miles' age and everything, maybe even cash in on the popularity of the Tom Holland Spider-Man in the MCU, but it doesn't make any sense from a story perspective. Peter is supposed to be Miles' mentor, the older, wiser, and more experienced one, giving him advice on how to use his powers, and how to deal with obstacles he is faced with. When you hear all this stuff come out of this kid essentially, it just doesn't have as much impact as it did before. In the first game, Peter looked like he was in his mid to late 20s, but in Spider-Man Miles Morales, he looks like he could be as young as 15. Miles himself is supposed to be like 16 or 17, so it just doesn't work. Haley Cooper, the deaf street artist Miles befriends, one of my favorite side characters in Spider-Man Miles Morales by the way, mentions at one point that there has been a Spider-Man defending New York ever since she was a kid, which begs the question, how old is she? Because Haley looks like she could be as old as Peter is. So what, when she was a kid? Do the math there, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I also want to bring up the City That Never Sleeps DLC that I recently reviewed on my channel that takes place between the events of the 2018 game and this one. In it, Black Cat lies to Peter about having a son he believes could be his, which means that the two of them would have had sex at some point in the past, and seeing this new design for Peter, that just makes that whole scenario far less believable and even a bit icky, to be honest. How old was Peter when it happened? Did Black Cat have sex with a minor? That's something I didn't think a Spider-Man video game would make me think about and question. Jesus. Anyways, it's about time that I got into the story of Spider-Man Miles Morales. Now this game came out last year, it's fairly new, so if you haven't played it before, in its entirety, then you might not want to keep watching this review, because I will be spoiling some stuff. Okay, so Spider-Man Miles Morales centers around Miles adjusting to his life as the new Spider-Man in New York, and more specifically, Harlem. He's trying to balance his personal responsibilities with the responsibilities of being a superhero, facing all the challenges that go along with it, which is much easier said than done. He wants to make his father proud and lives by the words he told Miles before he died, to never give up.
Or maybe I'm just a guy who doesn't give up.
The story of this game discusses a lot of ideas and themes present with the Peter Parker Spider-Man, a lot of stuff we have seen countless times before, but it also builds on them in its own way, because naturally, this story is all about Miles, about his journey, stepping out from behind the shadow of the original Spider-Man, who he is always comparing himself to, and learning to be his own hero, be his own Spider-Man, to be himself. Peter does play a significant role in this game. He fights alongside Miles at the beginning, and later trains Miles through various hologram challenges he has set up across the city, one even going into the story of Peter's first run-in with the Vulture at Empire State University, the first supervillain he had ever encountered, which is pretty cool. You end up fighting two of them at one point, and Peter does a hilarious Vulture voice all throughout. But the game removes Peter from the playing field very early on, with him leaving New York for several weeks to take photos of the ongoing civil war in Symkaria for the Daily Bugle. He's going there with MJ, who is writing a report on it. So already this game has high stakes, because even though Peter may be there for Miles in spirit, he can't be there physically if something goes wrong, at least be there as quickly as he needs to be. So a lot of weight is now on Miles' shoulders. He has more responsibility than he can really handle at the beginning of this game. If he's got to fight a few muggers here and there over the span of the next 2 weeks, that wouldn't be an issue. But what happens if he has to deal with some new supervillain? Is he ready to take on that kind of challenge alone? Well, that's exactly what this game asks, and then of course answers. Miles' new home in Harlem becomes threatened by a gang war between the Roxxon Energy Corporation with their armored red and gray security force and the newly formed Underground, a high-tech terrorist group led by the mysterious Tankerer. The entire conflict surrounds an energy source known as Newform, created by Roxxon, that they intend to not only make the new power source of New York, but the rest of the world. The head of research and development at Roxxon, and the one behind this new form energy project, is Simon Krieger, who acts as one of this game's primary antagonists. He's essentially the face of the company, establishing a strong relationship between it and the community, pushing for Newform to become the next big thing, and telling the public that it is a clean form of energy, despite it being highly dangerous, and prolonged exposure to it can lead to death, the result of bone marrow decay. From the moment Krieger appears in this game, you know he's a villain. He's got such a smug face, a punchable face, and he represents Roxxon, a company that's always depicted as evil in the comics. Krieger is a ruthless businessman, a psychopath, who doesn't care how many lives he will end or how many people he needs to exploit. All that matters is the money, the profit that can be made from it. He presents himself as this positive figure to the public, but deep down he is as sinister and corrupt as they come. As a villain, I found this character to be pretty effective. He's cliché, but it's a cliché that works, and Insomniac dials up the crazy factor to 11, which I think helps him stand out a little bit, compared to a lot of other similar characters we have seen like this, with these same kinds of motivations. Krieger is nothing special, at least in my opinion, but he does get the job done, serves his purpose within this narrative.
Smell like next level bioengineering. And you know what that smells like to me, kid? That smells like money.
The Rhino is featured in Miles Morales, returning after his appearance in the first game as a member of Dr. Octopus's Sinister Six. At the beginning of the game, he is being transported in a giant prison crate via helicopter, which crashes, and Rhino is then set free to wreak havoc on the city. Peter and Miles team up to stop him, with Miles even riding the villain through an amazing shopping mall sequence, and during their resulting battle, Miles' first Venom ability manifests itself. After Rhino is defeated by Miles, Krieger and his Roxxon soldiers arrive to apprehend him, though it's later revealed that Krieger had instead hired Rhino to become an enforcer for Roxxon, and would upgrade him with stronger red armor from their research department that is resistant to Miles' Venom attacks, which I thought was an interesting idea. Another side villain under the employ of Krieger is the Prowler, a character who you knew was going to be featured in this game, especially following the popularity of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I like the direction Insomniac takes with this character here. Prowler is of course Miles' uncle, Aaron Davis, who was cast out of their family due to his criminal dealings, which soured the relationship between him and his brother, Miles' father. Davis isn't depicted as a straight-up villain here. He has a checkered past, he has done some bad things, but he is trying to move on and better himself. I also love that he knows Miles as Spider-Man right from the get-go. The game doesn't feel the need to dumb it down for the audience. He would know what Miles sounds like. They don't need to beat around the bush and fall into that classic and overused cliché. I'm glad they did something different here. Much like the Peter Parker Spider-Man, Prowler also plays the role of a teacher and mentor for Miles in this game. He trains Miles a little bit and even gives him some useful gadgets to add into his arsenal. There are some side missions that involve Miles finding unique sounds throughout the city to make into a mixtape, and during these sequences, you learn more of the backstory between the Davis brothers' relationship. It ends with Miles' uncle giving him a new costume, one of my favorites in the game, the purple rain suit, based off the Prowler's own costume. Like I had mentioned, the Prowler isn't depicted as a full-on villain here, but like I also mentioned, he is under the employ of Simon Krieger and Roxxon. When Miles begins digging into the company, his uncle Aaron urges that he stay away from them. He does this to not only protect his nephew and make sure he doesn't meet the same fate that his father did, but also because he knows at some point, if Miles doesn't let up, the two are going to have to fight each other, something Davis wants to avoid at all costs, if he can. You do end up fighting the Prowler, which was inevitable. Miles and his uncle were on a collision course with each other in this story, and the boss battle was one of the more enjoyable ones in this game. It reminded me of the one with Taskmaster from the original game, but it was more challenging, as the Prowler made use of far more gadgets and abilities, such as invisibility and creating hologram duplicates of himself. I really enjoyed the Prowler in this game. I think the writing surrounding the character was pretty solid, allowing him to stand on his own compared to a lot of other adaptations we have seen of this character outside of the comics. Is he the best? Probably not. I think a lot of people would still put the one from Into the Spider-Verse above it, in terms of emotional resonance and everything, but this one is still pretty damn good. I'm not complaining. Okay, so now it is time to discuss the main antagonist of Spider-Man Miles Morales, the Tinkerer. I have gone on record in the past explaining my distaste I have for the Tinkerer as a character. While not terrible, I have just never found him all that interesting. He's just an old guy who's good with machines, can build shit, that's really all there is to him. He's kind of boring, unimpressive. When I found out the Tinkerer was going to be in this game, most likely to play a prominent role, I was a bit skeptical to say the very least. But now, having played this game and completed it, this is by far the best interpretation of this character I have ever seen or experienced. Probably the best we'll ever get, spanning movies, comics, and yes, video games. That's right, I said it. Insomniac took this very forgettable and bland character and gave it so many layers, made it far more compelling than it had ever been before. I think it was a brilliant way to adapt the Tinkerer, and I want to give it the praise it deserves in this video, because I don't think enough people are really taking the time to talk about it. The Tinkerer is revealed to be Miles's lifelong friend Finn Mason, who grew up with him, was like a sister to him, and the two of them were inseparable. They had a love for science, and would end up winning an award together at the New York Science Convention held at the Oscorp Science Center when they were younger. The two were very close, but grew apart after they had enrolled at separate high schools, and couldn't be together as much as they wanted to. Miles moving to Harlem also didn't help matters. Finn's older brother Rick, another close friend of Miles, was a brilliant scientist who worked for Roxxon Energy and was the one who created Nuform. He would become sick from his exposure to it, discovering how dangerous it really was, and wanted to put a stop to its production. With Finn's help, Rick would sneak into Roxxon's lab and try to destroy their Nuform sample, but would be killed by Simon Krieger in the process. Finn would swear revenge against Roxxon and Krieger for the death of her brother, and would use her knowledge of science and invention to create programmable matter that could be turned into various weapons and physical enhancements. Using this special biotech, she would create a new identity for herself, known as the Tinkerer, and form the terrorist group, the Underground. Her plan is to overload the Nuform reactor at Roxxon's lab, turning it into a giant bomb to destroy their entire complex. However, Miles would learn that Krieger altered the specs of the reactor so that the explosion caused by the Underground would not only destroy Roxxon, but all of Harlem. He does this because it would mean good PR for the company, knowing that it had become the victim of an awful terrorist attack. Krieger doesn't give two shits about Harlem because he intends on building a Roxxon city from its ashes. Now, I am going to be honest with all of you. At first, and for a huge chunk of this story, I found it really difficult to get behind Finn as a character, as a villain, and maybe some of you out there did too. I found it hard to sympathize with her and some of her actions, because I felt so much of the needless violence and anger could have been easily avoided if she just opened up about her emotions, had a simple sit-down talk with Miles. Once Miles learns of Krieger's true intentions, turning the underground attack on Roxxon against all of Harlem, that too makes Finn come off as really dense and stubborn, because she refuses to listen to what Miles has to say, and thinks she's always right with her calculations and everything. But these were all really misconceptions in the end, because the story surrounding Finn won me over following her team-up with Miles against the Rhino, when Rhino triggers her, taking shots at her dead brother. You realize then and there that the friend Miles still sees in her, that version of Finn he knew all those years ago, is gone. She's dead. She died with her brother. Her grief is what makes her so stubborn. Her immense anger and pent-up emotions surrounding the loss of her brother clouds her better judgment, and it's not something you can really attack this character for, because dealing with grief is a complicated thing. It's different for everyone. Even if you don't agree with her motivations as a villain, or the way she enacts her revenge, saying she's stubborn or dense, it doesn't matter, because you don't know what she's thinking. It's impossible for anyone but her to really understand what she's going through. Both Miles and Finn are motivated by grief, and find themselves on opposite sides of the law. They both made a promise to themselves following the death of a loved one, and will stop at nothing to follow through with it, whatever the cost, even if that means they will have to fight each other. And I think this is why the conflict of this story works so well, because they are amazing foils for one another as characters. At the end of the game, Finn realizes that she was wrong, and sacrifices herself to save Miles and Harlem. Miles had used his bioelectricity to absorb the energy of the new form reactor, and his body had to release it in order for him to survive. Finn would use her propulsion boots to carry him into the sky, high above Harlem, and tells him to let go. It was a very powerful moment, a very beautiful moment, because she herself had in many ways also let go of all of her pain and anger. Spider-Man Miles Morales is an incredible Spider-Man experience. It's one of the best Marvel video games ever made. I'd probably rank it in the top 5. Its story is phenomenal, and feels like a movie at times. It's that good. I think I prefer the narrative from the original Spider-Man game over it, just because it adapted characters like Doc Ock and Mr. Negative in such interesting ways, had the Sinister Six and everything, but there were some elements of Miles Morales I actually enjoyed more than the first game. Because it was shorter, I think the pacing of its story was much stronger, because in the 2018 game, it does have a pretty slow start, and takes a while to really get going. I also found the gameplay in Miles Morales to be more enjoyable as well. The combat is far more flashy, with the addition of venom attacks, which are a lot of fun and satisfying to pull off, and the stealth sections also had more depth to them, thanks to Miles's invisibility. Superhero characters like Miles Morales are important because they show the world that anyone can be a superhero. Anyone can possess the qualities and characteristics that make up one. Everyone deserves role models like this to look up to and see themselves as. If we all had selfless characters like Miles to aspire to be like, the world might be a better place to live in. My hope is that in 10 or 20 years' time, that a lot of these kinds of stories will become the norm, that elements in them will be widely accepted by the masses, and they won't be so quick to label them as woke or diverse for the sake of being diverse, SJW propaganda, none of that stupid nonsense, because a lot of these people fail to realize that stories like these are just trying to make up for lost time, after decades and decades of misrepresentation. You can't really blame them for being so in your face about it at times, at least right now. Eventually, all of this will balance itself out. That's the goal. That's what equality is all about. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a milestone in the superhero game genre. When was the last time a black protagonist was featured as the primary character in one of these things? In a mainstream AAA title? I couldn't really tell you. I hope the success of this game leads to the creation of more diverse superhero stories in video games, because there are a lot of characters out there that deserve their time in the spotlight, just like Miles Morales. And I hope that Miles himself gets another standalone game, or at the very least, he will be featured prominently in the sequel to the 2018 one. I wonder what direction the story is going to go in. Will we get to play as both Spider-Men, switch between them at certain points throughout the narrative? That would be cool. Will Insomniac decide to kill off Peter Parker like what happened in the comics? I doubt it, because this universe is slightly different to that one, and I think New York is big enough to have two Spider-Men working within it. But hey, you never know. This has been NerdGasm. I hope you all enjoyed my review of Spider-Man Miles Morales, and I want to thank everyone for voting for this game review topic over on Patreon.com. If you would like to take part in the monthly polls to determine which superhero games and even comic books I look at on the channel, you can do so by becoming a financial backer for my content over on Patreon, by joining any of the tiers I have for you guys over there. I want to thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care and stay nerdy.